Hi there, my name is Marty Snyder, and today I'm going to talk about some research that I have been doing in collaboration with Dr. Lori P. Dringas. The title of this presentation for the Florida Educational Research Association Conference is using interpretative phenomenological analysis as method for identifying training needs relating to the use of remote monitoring technologies among informal caregivers. I know that's a long title, but I will certainly break it down. This research comes out of a University President's Faculty Research and Development Grant funded by Nova Southeastern University. So the focus of today's presentation is to take a look at a qualitative research method called interpretative phenomenological analysis and how we used IPA to help understand the lived experience of informal caregivers who are caring for their loved ones who have dementia and are living at home. And the purpose of this particular presentation is to kind of take a look at the themes and come up with implications for how we might use what we learned to develop awareness and training programs that are focused on RMT adoption and use. So first of all, to define informal caregivers, these are family members who are unpaid to provide various levels of care. Examples include monitoring them, keeping tabs on them, shopping, helping them bathe, and also providing companionship. And this is for their family members, for example, a parent, a spouse, a sibling, aunt, uncle, etc. Now, remote monitoring technologies are technologies that can sense, record, and communicate various activities and data. Some examples of RMTs include personal emergency response pendants, similar to the Great Call, right? That's an example, the Great Call pendant that a person can wear around his or her neck or on a wrist that they can press a button to alert someone that they need help. There are also products such as alarm.com that can sense motion within the home and can send a alert to a caregiver who might be remote, living, maybe 5 miles away or wherever. That helps the caregiver monitor the daily activities of the care recipient to sort of track to see, if there's a disruption in when they get up at a certain time or leave the house, that sort of thing. There are also floor mats with sensors that can send a message to indicate when a person is getting out of bed. And then there are also remote video monitoring so that you can place these in various rooms of the house to keep tabs to see how your loved one is doing throughout the day. Now, why is it important to study informal caregivers and technology? Well, I'm going to refer to an AARP study from 2016 in which they reported that in 2014 there were approximately 40 million Americans who provided unpaid care to an adult, and they expect by 2020 that 117 million Americans are expected to need assistance. They did report that millions of caregivers are under the age of 50 and are comfortable using technology, so this was something that they pointed out. However, our study focuses more on the older caregiver. I did want to bring this out because I found that it was relevant because many of these, this population is already very comfortable with technology. And finally, there's a need for user-centered design so that technology innovations meet the needs of this population of caregivers and their care recipients. In a review of the literature, there's been a lot reported in the extant literature, and some of these themes include acceptance and use of technology in general, by older adults, and also to support persons with dementia and their caregivers. So different apps that can be used, different programs and things like that. Healthcare providers' perceptions of technologies for monitoring older adults within the institutional setting. There have been reports of trends in family caregiving in general, a focus on design of specific technologies used for care for the elderly, and an understanding of how caregivers are using technology, what functionality is most useful, and barriers to use. So, however, what we found as the research gap is an understanding of how informal caregivers or family caregivers can use remote monitoring technologies to monitor and support the health, the safety, and well-being of their care recipients in an in-home setting. And this research is limited. The informal caregiver's voice is also underrepresented or not included at all in the literature. So the grand tour question for our study was, how do informal caregivers make sense of remote monitoring technologies in their caregiving roles? These are the research questions. What problems are expressed by informal caregivers regarding the current way they monitor and support their care recipients? How do informal caregivers perceive the features and applications of existing RMTs for monitoring and supporting their care recipients? What do informal caregivers perceive as benefits and risks of using RMTs to monitor and support their care recipients? And what are the needs of informal caregivers relative to their adoption and use of RMTs? Our research design was primarily qualitative and phenomenological. The methods that we used included a survey followed by semi-structured interviews, and the purpose of the survey was generally to gather basic information, identify interview participants, and help us develop an interview guide. There are much larger scale studies that have been focused, such as the AARP, on technology use. And the interviews helped us gain a more in-depth understanding of caregivers and their perceptions about the use of RMTs. Now, we used descriptive statistics to analyze the results of the questionnaire, and as I mentioned, interpretative phenomenological analysis for the interviews. The participants in setting included informal caregivers of adult family members who live at home. A little bit about interpretative phenomenological analysis. First, it examines how people make sense of major life experiences. So we were trying to understand the lived experience of informal caregivers and how they perceive and or use remote monitoring technologies to help in their caregiving roles. It combines phenomenology, which is understanding of the lived experience, hermeneutics, which is the interpretation of the experience, and ideography, which is a focus on the detail or the particulars of individual experiences. And with regard to hermeneutics, Smith, Flowers, and Larkin talk about this double hermeneutic loop where the participant is trying to make sense of his or her experience while the researcher is trying to make sense of what the participant is making sense of. So it's a very in-depth, detailed analysis. And that is why most IPA studies have small, purposeful, and homogeneous samples so that they can focus on these particulars. However, the effectiveness is really judged in an IPA study by the light that it sheds within the broader context. So based on the results that we come up with, how does this shed light on the broader context of informal caregivers and their experience with remote monitoring technologies. So I'm not going to go into detail about our survey results. Again, the focus was really to just get a baseline idea, to recruit participants, and also to help us develop our interview guide. But as you can see here, it's not surprising that, and there were 38 caregivers who completed the survey. The majority were female, ages 40 to 69, primarily white, and working full-time, half of them. The majority were caring for either their mother or mother-in-law. They lived in the same residence as their care recipient or less than 5 miles from their care recipient. The age of the care recipients, the majority were age 70 to 89. 45% are the primary caregiver, and 26% have a formal caregiver who provides most of the care. 71% provide care and assistance on a daily basis. And of this 38 participants, the majority did not currently use remote monitoring technologies. Now, we selected from that sample 7 interview participants. And so we interviewed those participants, and this is a general demographic, so it reflects the demographic of the survey results. But once we conducted those interviews and did just a basic analysis, we decided to select a more homogeneous group of 4 of those transcripts to analyze more deeply, because all 4 were caring for a loved one who had some degree of cognitive decline. So this is the characteristics. These are the characteristics of the interview subset. Again, we had 4 participants, and as you can see here, contrary to the results of the survey, their familiarity ranged from moderate to high, and all of them had used remote monitoring technologies, although their use and experience ranged from low to moderate to high. These are the questions that guided our interviews. As you can see, we had the interviews lasted around 45 minutes to an hour, and we started out with getting to know the caregiver. It's an empathic type of interview to understand their lived experience and what their day in the life might look like. And then we moved into questions that focused more on their perceptions and use of remote monitoring technologies. Now, for transcript analysis, we did have rev.com transcribe the interviews. So we did have those text transcripts, and that helped us in reading and rereading the transcripts word for word, and then doing some initial noting and exploratory commenting. And then as we continued to read and sort of make sense of the information, we developed some emergent themes and tried to search for connections across emergent themes within each case. And then you go from case to case to case, so we had 4. And then going and taking more of a broader view of looking at patterns across cases. So we found that a lot of the codes and categories that we identified sort of crossed over. And I'll share a little bit more about that. So this is an example of how we used Microsoft Word to do our initial noting and commenting, and this kind of helped us generate some basic codes. We call this doing this by hand rather than using a qualitative data analysis tool, such as NVivo or Quarkos. We were able to do this, number one, because we had a small sample size, although it was still intensive work, and also it really helped us get close to the data. So as you can see here, using Microsoft Word's comment tools, we identified some preliminary notes and commenting. And here's another example. And these ultimately were looked at again, and we tried to collect them into broader codes or overarching categories and themes. So in developing emergent themes and searching for connections, we tried, as I mentioned, to take some of the codes and come up with some more broader themes. And these included themes such as carer concerns, RMT benefits, RMT risks, and adoption and use needs. And these tie back also to our research questions and interview guide, so you can see the connection there. We used this type of a table format to help us search for connections across cases. So for example, one of the themes or qualitative distinctions was caregiver concerns about being isolated and having no help, and this exacerbated feelings of frustration and being overwhelmed. And then in the middle category or middle column, we tried to identify some exemplary quotes that reflected or described that particular qualitative distinction, and then tried to make sense of it and interpret that from a more broader perspective. So as you can see here, the ideas were that the caregiver is frustrated and overwhelmed in their role because oftentimes the work falls on them. They love and care so much for their family member, so they're not a paid caregiver necessarily. This is a family member who has a strong attachment to their loved one, and that can stress them out even more. So some patterns across cases, we group them into four patterns or themes, including the family caregiver connection, the risk-benefit conundrum, the human-technology interaction and usability, and tailored solutions. Now, in these next few slides, we can't present everything that we're working on because of the lack of time. But if we're going to be focusing in this case on education and training needs, these themes I'm going to present with one exemplary quote that represents one of the many facets or qualities of the theme. So starting with family caregiver connection. As I mentioned here, the context of informal care is special and can be described through the unique connection family caregivers have with their loved ones. Participants express feelings of frustration, isolation, and being overwhelmed, while at the same time emphasizing love, compassion, and empathy towards their relative, and this intense love can also bring emotional pain and distress. Kara discusses dignity with regard to her rationale for purchasing a webcam to monitor the caregiver that she hired. During the Skype interview, she held up a photo of her brother and said, "I'm showing you this photo to show you that he dressed very professionally and immaculately. Sometimes when I go over to visit my brother, the carers just have an old fleece on him. I'd say, just because he's got Alzheimer's, please respect how he is dressed. This is where it started. I need to be able to monitor without the feeling of having to go over every single day, twice or 3 times a day, and paying a mint for carers." Now, with regard to risk-benefit conundrum. Regarding the perceived risks and benefits of RMTs, there is a conundrum between the benefits of having peace of mind, reduced caregiver burden, a sense of self-efficacy, and greater independence versus perceiving RMTs as an invasion of privacy and security, a false sense of security, and a distraction. So with regard to a false sense of security, when discussing the use of emergency response pendants, Samantha noted, "My reluctance is that it can't stop something from happening to her. It just alerts you maybe if something does." There are also issues related to human technology interaction and usability. So with regard to RMTs for monitoring and supporting their relatives, issues pertaining to the way they interact with technology as well as usability were mentioned. So Lucy mentioned that monitoring devices that look like jewelry would be appealing. So there's an appeal when referring to medical bracelets. She described that she could never get her husband to wear a medical alert bracelet that had a medical sign, basically, identifying them that they had some problem, right? That they, I have epilepsy or I have diabetes. She explained, but if something were to look like a Fitbit or a loci bracelet, or even one of those rubber bracelets that you wear when you are raising money for something, he would wear that. So it was this idea of being branded with a disease, and that the recipient didn't necessarily feel that they wanted to have that stigma. Finally, the tailored solutions refers to that there's no one-size-fits-all with regard to education and training. While there are some commonalities, each family caregiving situation is unique. So when considering how we can facilitate adoption and use, there are issues pertaining to the progressive nature of dementia, availability and format of information, features and benefits, privacy and security, as well as cost. So with regard to progressive education and the need to follow a progressive condition such as dementia, Devin stated, "I wish that some of the technology companies did the exact same thing so that when you get your diagnosis of Alzheimer's, or you go back a year later and there's been a decline, such as our situation, they can hand you a packet." So it's really kind of following and providing tailored solutions of tailored technology solutions depending on the stage you are in the disease. Now, implications on education and training. And this is just one piece of our study, but since this is an education conference, I'm wanting to focus on this in particular. What we found in our research is that training on RMTs should address the emotional, the ethical, the financial, the social, and technical needs. Issues regarding value, safety, reliability, privacy, data security, and quality should also be considered. We also want to highlight that the caregiver and the care recipient dyad should be included in the participatory design of education and training solutions. And then finally, current and future IT health technology professionals also need to be educated and trained on these issues in order to design RMTs that meet the needs of this population and facilitate adoption and use. Thank you so much. I hope you found this presentation valuable. And if you have any comments or questions, feel free to email me at smithmt@nova.edu or Dr. Dringus, the co-principal investigator, at lori@nova.edu.